The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always.
Join us today as we discuss How Doctors Think by Jerome Groopman, MD.
Welcome back to the part of the Virtual Curbside where I get to have a friend. It's always exciting for me to look forward to having the book club episodes with Angelo Giardino, who is a great reader and just a pleasure to talk about books with. Welcome back, Angelo.
Thanks, Paul. I've been really looking forward to talking to you about this book. It was a really great read.
So I got to choose the book this month, and I've been really interested in thinking about how we think about stuff and also in the process of taking care of patients. There were some other things, other books that I ruled out, but I really liked this one because I think he writes so awfully well and helps me understand, I think, a little bit more about how I think as a doctor.
Yeah, I think first of all, Jerome Groopman, Dr. Groopman is a really great storyteller. So he can really spin a story and root it in the clinical details of the case. So obviously, as a physician reader, I'm quite intrigued by that and I'm pulled in. And then I think that in this book, he does a really good job at talking about all these different cognitive biases and kind of how we think, but he tells it in the context of telling stories, which makes it so much more interesting and so much more approachable than the classic article on cognitive bias that has a table with different cognitive biases. And it's just like, by the time you get to the third or fourth one, you're like, oh God, I don't know if I can keep reading this.
Yeah. And you get lost in the footnotes and you stick Post-its in the footnotes so you can keep going back to it. Let me just introduce him briefly. So he's chair of medicine at Harvard Medical School and widely published as a physician, but also writes for a popular audience as well, writes for New Yorker and has had op-ed pieces about medicine in New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic. And as you mentioned, writes very, very clearly. And it's interesting because he's published 5 books, all directed toward a lay audience. So this book is designed to help patients understand how their doctor is thinking, to help them advocate for themselves in the process. But I chose it partly because I wanted to try to make sure that I'm adopting some of those ways of thinking so that I'm taking better care of my patients.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, Paul, is I think he is definitely attuned to the challenges that both primary care and specialty care physicians have. And he uses that great metaphor of spinning plates. So if you think about, the typical entertainer who's spinning plates, they have a few dinner plates and they're spinning them and then they put them on like the dowels and they're spinning. And then he starts talking about like, if you're in primary care, you're spinning all sorts of different sized plates. The dowels that you're using are different sizes, and like they keep adding more plates to the plates you're spinning. And I think that metaphor, is an apt metaphor for all of the cognitive load that either a primary care physician or a specialty physician has to balance while they're doing a very, very complicated human interaction with a patient, taking a history, doing a physical, interpreting labs, reassuring the person, challenging the person. So I like the fact that he really comes to this with a deep understanding of just how complicated it is to be a doc. And I think that's really affirming.
I wonder sometimes whether I'm the last person in the world who understands the metaphor of spinning plates because I'm old enough to have watched people spin plates on the Ed Sullivan Show. But I think we get the point, and I think it's available on YouTube if you'd like to watch plate spinners, because I don't remember the last time that I saw one in actual action.
Yeah, well, again, I think if you watch that YouTube, you will definitely resonate with that. And then in that context, I think he's really sensitive then to what a physician has to deal with, particularly if the patient has a kind of a nuanced presentation or they're not improving with the standard approach that you're using. And then I think he really introduces some pretty sophisticated neuroscience around how we think, the classic fast thinking, slow thinking, which also sometimes is like reading concrete if you ever read in that area, but he makes it very approachable.
He does. He does. Yeah. You're right, because, he talks about things, the biases that interfere with careful systematic thinking, things like confirmation bias and satisfaction of search bias. And I think it's so important that we periodically step back and recognize that we do have those biases and that they change the way that we see things. I think I might be the last person to the table sometimes in understanding some terms. So I have seen and probably been guilty of using the term heuristics without really understanding it. And I think he makes it much clearer.
Right. No, I agree. So then, so you're getting that like in the background. To me, that's like the humming that's in the background. Then he tells these great stories, and some of them are quite personal. So he talks about his hand injury and talks about how the four different specialists that he saw, he could actually see kind of the biases that were like part of their approach to him. And so it becomes very real. And then I couldn't help but start thinking, like, do I do that? Like, because, I have like this sense that I'm really a legend in my own mind. So like, am I using those biases? Like, am I kind of not thinking this through carefully enough?
Angela, I'm willing to give you a pass, but I think the answer for all of us is, yeah, we do that.
Oh, you're just so brutal sometimes.
I could tell, by the way, which of the specialists got his hand problem right once he identified someone by name rather than Dr. A, B, C, or D.
Yes, no, he was considerate that way. And there is a pediatric case, which, is really unusual. But again, I think the point is that he really talks about kind of how this happens. And what I love is he turns it around a little bit. So he gives the doc advice throughout the book in terms of like, how do you challenge yourself so that you can have a little bit of metacognition and perhaps, say, am I thinking about other options? Have I developed a broad enough differential diagnosis? Am I really thinking through what's the worst thing this could be? So he gives us, he gives us some advice, but he also gives patients advice in terms of how they could partner with either their primary care provider or their specialist and not come off as, I just read something on the internet, defend yourself, but more almost kind of instilling in the encounter maybe an idea that, have we thought this through carefully enough? And could you walk me through your thinking? Which I think most physicians would appreciate and not feel defensive about.
Absolutely. And so in the last chapter, he actually gives a list of questions for people to ask. And let me just share those quickly, because I think that is something that we can think about, before or after we've read the book. The first question is, what else could it be, so that we don't jump to conclusions? Second one is there anything that doesn't fit, so that we're not just using confirmation bias? Third, is it possible that I have more than one problem, which Occam's razor notwithstanding, you can have more than one common thing at the same time? And then encourages patients to talk about what you're most worried about and open a discussion about either reassurance or more careful analysis. And then I think the thing that is so important to the whole thing is he advises people to retell the story from the beginning. And I think that's such an important thing for me to remember, that sometimes by hearing the story again, I think, oh, wait a minute, I had missed that completely in my thinking.
Yeah. And again, I think what I really appreciate about this book, and I was so glad that you recommended it, because in my patient safety work, and as you know, I've spent about 30 years now dealing with patient safety at a hospital level. One of the things I've really been getting more and more clear in my mind, and what's more and more of my focus, is the fact that we're not developing broad enough differentials at the clinical level. And because of that, we are prone to making diagnostic errors. And one of the things we're trying to do in our residency right now is really challenge folks to think about, in the workup phase, like, what is the differential? And let's at least put 2 or 3 other things on there, and challenging ourselves and disciplining ourselves.
Right.
to do that. So his work just, I think, beautifully displays why that's important. And that doesn't have to take 5 hours. Like, I mean, obviously most of us are pediatricians, right? So I never want to be an internal medicine specialist who spend hours on the differential. Like, and some of the stuff on the differential is truly just pedantic. It's just to impress somebody. But a real good differential is really, really valuable. And we've got to do that so that we don't kind of fall prey to these cognitive biases that are there for a reason, like they help us get through the day. So I'm really encouraging everybody to start thinking about broadening the differential diagnosis.
Right. In talking about the use of heuristics, where we have these mental shortcuts that give us a quick path to a diagnosis, the importance there is that we also have the ability to question those shortcuts.
Mm-hmm.
That just because I've seen it before and it looked like this before doesn't mean that it's still that.
Yeah, and then that recency thing, like I just saw 5 people with the flu, so the
Yeah.
6th case is likely the flu, and that's probably true on one hand, but it
Right.
might not be. So just that 1 or 2 seconds to say, well, maybe is there something else this could be before I just go down that road.
Yeah, I wanted to share a couple of his examples from the chapter in primary care. He starts the chapter by saying that primary care is like looking for a face in the window of a speeding train, but it's harder than looking for a needle in the haystack because haystacks don't move.
Uh-huh.
And so as these faces are speeding by, you're supposed to recognize the person
Right.
in there. And one of the other things he says is one of the challenges of pediatrics is that children are usually healthy and resilient unless they're not. And that's tough because there's increasing pressure on pediatricians to see more and more patients. And I think it becomes increasingly difficult to be thoughtful if the train is speeding by.
Yeah, I thought that was a really apt metaphor, and it made sense to me, right? Because as the train slows down, you can see the faces of the passengers. As it speeds up, it's harder to. And then it gets to a point where the speed is fast enough that really it's just hopeless. So we'll have to kind of factor that in, I think, to kind of what our expectations are of clinicians and being thoughtful about the fact that you can get the train going fast enough that you position everybody for making mistakes.
Right, right. Which is a disservice to everyone.
Yes.
It's a disservice to the patients because they come hoping to be seen and in every sense of that word. But it's a disservice, I think, to the providers as well because it's exhausting to try to stay tuned. And so I think it leads to burnout and I think it leads to not careful thinking.
Yeah, and the other thing I kind of reading between the lines, I think he's also telling a really cool story about a number of the physicians he highlights who have a great deal of joy in the practice of medicine and by
Yeah,
how
yeah,
by knowing how to think through these complicated details and stitching them together and ruling some things in and ruling some things out. And
right.
again, that for many of us, that was one of the things that made medicine exciting, is that we knew a lot about human physiology and the presentation of disease. So we could hear a story and start going down certain roads to confirm or disconfirm things.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, and one of the things I think is so admirable about the book is that I think in almost every instance where he talks about a superb clinician, is one of the questions he asks is, so tell me about a mistake you made. And I think that's so illustrative. The fact that we all are challenged by that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, he really, I think, provides a service. I've read several, he's actually interviewed this one guy, Dr. Crosscarry, who's from Canada, who's like a foundational transformational figure in this cognitive bias work. And I've read a lot of his articles, and they're wonderful articles, but they always have these lists that
Yeah.
I kind of get lost in. But that work is obviously the underpinning of all of the stories he's telling. But this is a good way to kind of get connected to those biases. And then, I'm hoping that I'm using this now to challenge myself when I'm going down the one of these biases and just at least just thinking about the fact I'm probably doing this.
Right. The other thing is that he certainly is sympathetic to the fact that primary care is not reimbursed well, and so there's more pressure to see more patients. And he also, and this is a 20-year-old book,
Mhm.
talks about what payers tend to want to do then is introduce either algorithms and protocols so
Yeah.
that you don't have to think about stuff. And of course, the problem with that, but also neighboring that things like incentivizing key tasks, like, did I chart a BMI rather than incentivizing thoughtfulness?
Yeah. So again, one thing I've learned in life, Paul, is whenever somebody says, use this and you don't have to think about it.
Right.
Oh, that's a red blinking light. That's a bad thing.
Yeah. He has a nice discussion of Bayesian logic, and he said it works until it doesn't, and that it really requires that we can step back and think more thoughtfully, as you've said, create a broader differential.
But to Dr. Groopman's credit, he even cast the insurance executive in a positive light. So, like, he's definitely a nice guy. I would love to meet him.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to share one slightly longer passage from this, since most of our listeners are in primary care. This is now a double quote because it's Jerome Groopman quoting Eric Cassell from Doctoring the Nature of Primary Care Medicine. This is a common error in thinking about primary care is to see it as entry-level medicine, and because of this, rudimentary medicine, for mostly, say, the common cold and imaginary illnesses. This is a false notion. One should not confuse highly technical, even complicated medical knowledge, special practical knowledge about an unusual disease, treatment, condition, or technology with the complex, many-sided, worldly wise knowledge we expect of the best physicians. The narrowest subspecialist, the reasoning goes, should also be able to provide this broad range of medical services. This naive idea arises, as do so many other wrong beliefs about primary care, because of the concept that doctors take care of diseases. Diseases, the idea goes on, form a hierarchy from simple to difficult. Specialists take care of difficult diseases, so of course they will naturally do a good job on simple diseases. Wrong. Doctors take care of people, some of whom have diseases, and all of whom have some problem. People used to doing complicated things usually do complicated things in simple situations. For example, ordering tests or x-rays when waiting a few days might suffice, thus overtreating people with simple illnesses and overlooking the clues about other problems that might have brought the patient to the doctor. I think that's just such a wonderful quote.
Yeah, no, I agree. There is a level of inspiration through the pages of the book as well.
Absolutely. And we were talking a bit beforehand that I really take great inspiration in his ability to explain things so well. And I was trying to remember who I had heard quoted saying this before, that someone's understanding of a problem is usually reflected in their ability to explain it simply. That it's very easy to make something sound complicated. And I always appreciate when my patients say, wait, back up a little minute. What in the world are you saying? And that usually means that I'm not thinking very clearly. I'm not explaining very clearly.
Right. No, I agree. Well, I really feel like this is a fun read. It's very informative. And even though it's a little dated, and some of the clinical scenarios, people might challenge because we have more evidence now about some of the stuff we talked about, I do think he makes the points he needs to make.
Absolutely. No, I'd recommend it very highly. I really, really quite enjoyed this book.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you picked it.
All right. I'd like to give myself a big pat on the back for choosing a really good book. Hey,
you're great. You're great.
I wanted to share another quote with you. I don't know if you've had a chance to read Abraham Verghese's new book, Covenant of Water. I hated to commit us, both to, I think it's 900 pages or something. But another shout out to reading fiction, since it's summer and we should all read a little bit of fiction. But in his new book, The Covenant of Water, one of the people says fiction is the great lie that tells the truth. I think that's just so resonant.
Wow. That's definitely from a literature major.
Absolutely. I'm recommending that book very highly. It's a great read in the old sense of just a great read that is a great saga that goes on, and it's fun to read. And he gets the medicine right, which is also good.
Oh, good.
All right. Thanks for the chat, Angelo. Looking forward to talking again in a couple of months.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design and editing thanks to Phil Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.